Our second speaker today is Mr. Manish Sabharwal, and he's the chairman and co-founder of Team Lead Services. Mr. Sabharwal is a member of the National Skill Mission at the Central Advisory Board of Education.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I work for a people supply chain company, and that is my vantage point. Or let's say, people are path dependent, is what historians say. And my path has been three things. I work for a people supply chain company that has hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 5 years. I spend about 30% of my time on public policy, whether it's RBI, CAG, and other things. And I was born and brought up in Kashmir. And that makes me realize that we don't live in an economy and we live in a society. But if I was to take the first avatar, Team Leads, I'm sort of at the agony and ecstasy of India's labor market, right? The ecstasy is obvious. I'm a child of low hiring standards. Kids getting a job with me today would not have got a job 5 years ago. I had a telecom client shouting at me pre-COVID saying, I have 200 sales positions open. Why aren't you filling them up? I said, well, your hiring standards are too high. This is India in 2020. So he called me back in a few hours and said, okay, I need a pair of hands. I don't care if a brain comes attached. Now, economists might worry about the productivity impact of lower hiring standards, but from a public policy perspective, you're getting kids into the labor force who would not have got a job a few years ago. But the agony wasn't as obvious to me till I started Teen Leads. We had a job fair in Jaipur. 30,000 kids showed up. I met 800 of them. I can guarantee if they were born in Delhi, Bombay, or Bangalore, they would have had a job. But they were born in Dausa, Barmer, Jhunjhunu, or Ajmer. So the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and to choose your PIN code wisely. Now, that's from a micro perspective, right? But if you think about India, the most interesting question is, how have we created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society? But why didn't we create the world's largest economy? Should technically be easier to create an economy than a democracy. And the question which always sort of haunts me is, why is India poor? And I would make the case that poverty is about productivity, and productivity depends on the productivity of individuals, the productivity of firms, and the productivity, obviously, of regions. My regions we won't spend time on, but my parents retired to UP. I live in Karnataka. Both states have the same GDP, yet Karnataka has one-fourth the number of people. So people in Karnataka are 4 times more productive than uh, people in UP. Now, obviously, as an individual, we know that people can be very different productive. But today's focus is really on firms, right? As entrepreneurs. I have learned as an entrepreneur that there are two kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. A baby and a dwarf are both small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. I've had the privilege of creating both a baby and a dwarf, right? My first company, India Life, was a 75 crore company, and my second company is 5,000 crores this year, and we're still a baby in diapers. So, what was the difference between a baby and a dwarf is something I often think about at an individual level, but also from a policy perspective. India has 63 million enterprises, 12 million of them don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million are registered for GST, only 1 million pay social security, and there are only 22,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. Why? Do we need 63 million enterprises? The US economy is 8 times our size and it only has 24 million enterprises. So most enterprises in India are built on what an economist calls self-exploitation, China, where you say you don't pay yourself a salary, you don't pay your kids a salary, you don't price your resources. So self-employment can often be self-exploitation. But if we want India to be more prosperous, then we want our firms to be more productive. The World Bank just did a survey on manufacturing companies in India. If you take the largest companies and the smallest companies, then there's a 24 times difference in productivity. Now, with a 24 times difference in productivity, you'll never be able to pay the wage premium. But if you never pay the wage premium, you'll never be productive. So we're stuck in this low level equilibrium in India with lots of enterprises, lots of entrepreneurs. But at a policy level, our labor is handicapped without capital, and our capital is handicapped without labor. So of the 22,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores, they have a lot of capital, but they don't have much labor. And many Indian enterprises have a lot of labor, but they don't have enough capital. So there is a policy perspective on productivity, which is really, really important, which I hope gets solved as we formalize, urbanize, industrialize, financialize, and skill India. Now, that's sort of from a macro perspective. That the reason my case to you would be is that India is poor because we're inadequately urbanized. We only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. We're inadequately financialized. Our credit to GDP ratio is only 50%. It should be 100%. We're inadequately industrialized. Only 11% of our people work in manufacturing, and 45% of our people work on farms. And farmers only generate 15% of GDP. So the only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. We're inadequately skilled is obvious to everybody, whether we take it from the perspective of schools, or only 10% of Indians have a college degree, only 15% of people who start class one actually finish up. And obviously, we only have, 500,000 apprentices in India. Where learning by doing and learning while learning is a powerful way. We should have 15 million apprentices. So from a macro perspective, I think the reform process has to urbanize, financialize, industrialize, and skill India. And it also has to formalize India. But from an entrepreneur's perspective, how should we think about this problem, right? That how do I ensure that my company is not a baby, is a baby, not a dwarf? The difference between a baby and a dwarf is not more food. It's not money. It's really in DNA, right? And over my sort of reflection, I'd like to make the case that the world is becoming is moving much faster now. So lifelong learning, that old notion of sort of 25 years of learning, 25 years of earning, and 25 years of retirement, that train has left the station. There's a new world of work, there's a new world of education, and there's a new world of organizations. The new world of work is obvious. The average life expectancy of Fortune 500 company when the first list came out in 1955 was 64 years. It's now 14. Now, what's the value of a pension promise of a company that lives only 14 years? Or how should you think about your employment at a company which lives only 14 years? And work was always linked to offices, and work was always linked to an employment contract. And I think work is now decoupling itself from offices and an employment contract. Obviously, the new world of education is challenging for all of us. In a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless. Learning how to learn is the key skill. Right? Curiosity matters more than intelligence. Soft skills matter more than hard skills. And learning and knowing is not that valuable. William Butler Yeats, he was an Irish poet. He used to say, education is not the filling of a bucket, it is the lighting of a fire. And my case would be that people like me who went to a CBSE school, for us, education was the filling of the bucket. It was not the lighting of a fire. And we had to sort of come up with our own program for lifelong education, or for sort of keeping up with the world, if you might think about it. And obviously, there's a new world for India. I think that there is a window here for India as the world population ages, as China fatigue all over sets in. And we are probably the only large country in the world with more than, say, 100 million people, with 20 years of growth ahead of us, obviously because of our past sins, but that is where we are today. And so I would submit that we have to fix our macro, which is obviously formalizing, urbanizing, industrializing, financializing India, and skilling it. At a micro level, we have to fix our school system, we have to fix our college system, and we have to fix our vocational training system. But the system which is within our control as entrepreneurs is how do we organize our firms? How do we organize our teams? And what kind of individuals do we think of as really productive? So my case would be is, if you reflect, an educator since history, whether it was Tagore, Vygotsky, or Solzhenitsyn, always said, we don't learn from experience, we learn by reflecting on experience. And my submission would be that the most important question to ask yourself as an entrepreneur is the one that Jonas Salk, he was the inventor of the polio vaccine, he once said. He said, the most important question is, are you being a good ancestor? And I think It's a really interesting question in the context of a pandemic. But as I look upon companies that I respect, I think they were good ancestors as entrepreneurs, as boards. And obviously, the biggest difference between a company and that scales and one that doesn't scale, or a company that is productive and that is not productive, is they get the right balance between the next quarter and the next quarter century. It is a false trade-off to say that I can maximize the short term or I will maximize the long term, but I won't do both. And one of the most fundamental differences between a baby and a dwarf is the balance between the next quarter and the next quarter century. I think the other sort of difference between a baby and a dwarf, which we have to think about in the Indian context, is entrepreneurs have three different roles. Our role as chief executives, our role as board members, our role as shareholders are three distinct roles. Our shareholder role, no one can take away from us. And we have a very simple metric for that, the worth of the company. But our role as board members is about the delicate balance between the next quarter and next quarter century. And our role as executives is obviously delivering the next quarter so that the series of quarters can lead to the next quarter century. And I would submit traditionally Indian entrepreneurs thought all those three roles were concurrent, all those three roles were guaranteed. And that is not how life turns out to be. Because if you think about many companies in India that have done well, they have thought, or their entrepreneurs have thought about these three roles being distinct and have sort of set in a plan for partitioning these three roles. So I'd say that is a very distinct sort of skill set that I see among entrepreneurs who grew up in a certain India where these three roles were the same, but now we're starting to see them unpacked and we're starting to see them make a difference when they are unpacked. Obviously, the most important goal I would submit is an organization that keeps its eye on output. And this is a very important skill as an entrepreneur because we tend to confuse sort of input and output. We confuse activity with progress. We confuse action with motion. But that is really not what happens. And so good organizations are those where you think about your values, you think about your goals, you convert that into a strategy, you convert that into a structure, and you convert that into a team. And this is a palindrome, right? Your team has to fit into your structure, which follows your strategy, which goes into your goals, which goes into your values. I think many of the baby versus dwarf differences come from the lack of alignment between these sort of five or six elements in a company. Because if you try and implement strategies without structures that are congruent with them, you never get anything done. So it's sort of the old, one of my favorite quotes is an American politician called Mario Cuomo. He says, "We politicians campaign in poetry, but we govern in prose." And when I was younger, I thought that this was sequential advice, right? That there was a poetry phase of entrepreneurship, then the entrepreneurs would hand over, and then there would be a prose phase of entrepreneurship. But as I grow older, I realized that no, it's about the right balance between poetry and prose. Because if you have too much poetry and no prose, you do nothing. You know, people talk and get nothing done. But if you have too much prose and no poetry, you do nothing great. There is some such thing as premature institutionalization of an entrepreneurial company, right? Because if you convert an entrepreneurial startup into a bureaucratic institution too early, you take away its birthright, but too late, you take away its destiny. And so, how do you get that balance right when you make the transition from being an entrepreneur led entrepreneur managed company to an entrepreneur led company to an entrepreneur governed company? It's really an individual choice. I'm just advocating that if you as an entrepreneur choose to say that I want my company to be a 500 crore company or a 5,000 crore company or a 50 crore company, you will have to make a lot of choices. Dumbledore tells Harry Potter in Chamber of Secrets, it is our choices more than our abilities that reveal what we really are. In retrospect, looking back over the next 20, 30 years, or the last 20, 30 years for me as an entrepreneur, I have realized I have run into many people who had average abilities but made quality choices. And there were people with high abilities who made bad choices. And I would submit that sort of judgment to make good choices comes from an awareness that you don't learn from experience, you learn by reflecting on experience. So if you think of your macro firm, then you have to think about what are high performing teams and what are high performing individuals. And I think this is where it starts getting more complex and more personal, right? I think obviously high performing teams are places where there is a shared values, shared goals, and shared sort of strategy. Obviously, your teams must hold each other accountable. And I think the team must be willing to accept the burden of leadership. So for me, this is really important. Leadership is not a noun, it's a verb, right? Just because somebody's called president or vice president doesn't make them president. President is what you do, it's not what you're called. And that is sort of where it bleeds into who are those teams going to be and what are 21st century teams. You know, all our 21st century organizations were modeled on the army or hierarchical organizations where, you know, the information flew up and then the orders flew down, and yours was not to reason why, yours was just to do and die. I would submit that you cannot run a modern corporation that way, not only because the world has become more complex and it takes a lot of different skills to make something happen, but because the world has become much less hierarchical. We don't have kings anymore who can cut off your head because you don't listen to them. And young kids and talent is the team you build, is the organization you build. Think very differently about culture. They think very differently about hierarchy. And more importantly, they think very differently about knowledge. They believe that networked organizations where sharing knowledge is the key to building intellectual capital. They believe sunshine is the best disinfectant, and expect full transparency on both sides. So I would submit that as you think about 21st century skills, where soft skills are more important than hard skills, you can also apply that to how you think about your teams or you think about your organization. Because intangible assets matter much more than fixed assets. You know, when Tata Steel went public in the early 1900s, you know, their market cap was 90% fixed assets. Today, Microsoft has less than 5% of its market cap being fixed assets, or say Infosys even. So I would submit that intangible assets or thinking about capitalism without capital is a sort of brute way to put it, right? That capital is much less important, the financial capital, than the intangible assets, which may be brands, which may be culture, which may be your um, a management trainee program, which may be your review schedules, which may be your goal setting process, which may be your strategy process, which may just be board effectiveness, right? And so for me, I think as an entrepreneur who is coming behind the next generation of entrepreneurs who have built great Indian companies, there was a clear difference between companies born after 1991 and pre 1991, right? Before 1991, you didn't, it was the license Raj, and many of those companies haven't survived because animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle. But all of us who have grown up in free markets and competitive markets don't compete based on regulatory arbitrage or some license. We compete based on the sweat of our brow, the courage in our heart, the creativity in our brains, and the strength of our backs. And all of you entrepreneurs are at the cusp of a 25-year opportunity in India. I think the next 25 years is going to be very different from the last 25 years in India. It wasn't God's will that it should take 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 66 million Britishers. Yet that's what it took. But I think we finally realized that you don't have to be Western to be modern. And now that we're getting our policy act together with labor reform, with agricultural reform, with banking reform, with ways of doing business reform, we've also got a new education policy, which sort of focuses on creativity, focuses on interdisciplinary learning. So I would see the new education policy, labor reform, agricultural reform, and many other things that are happening as connected about productivity. But that puts a much higher burden on all of us entrepreneurs in how we manage our companies, how we lead our companies, and how we govern our companies, in how we finance our companies. You know, entrepreneurship is often the art of staying alive long enough to get lucky. How do you get lucky? You buy more time by being frugal with capital. But being frugal with capital doesn't mean spending less capital than you need or more capital than you need. It means being just appropriate. And so I think that as China fatigue in supply chains sets in, as European populations decline, in Japan, the sale of adult diapers is crossing baby diapers, as we've seen in the chaos in the US elections. I think this is our opportunity for 1.3 billion Indians who, for various reasons, did not live up to our tryst with destiny, right? We missed our tryst with destiny over the last 75 years. I memorized Pandit Nehru's speech. But there are 300 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver, or sit in the car that they clean, or send their kids to the school that they help build. But this isn't a problem like cancer or climate change. This is a plumbing problem. It's a plumbing problem at three levels. I'll come back to that: at the country level, at the firms level, and at the individual level. I think we're starting to deal with the problem at the country level. I think education takes some time to fix, and we really need to fix our education systems. But as entrepreneurs, we have the opportunity on how we manage, lead, govern, and staff and finance our companies. And I think that it is an unfair advantage for lifelong learners. See, the only way to improve air traffic safety is to have plane crashes, right? I recently replaced my Japanese workhouse car with a Tata Nexon. And my mother was horrified. She asked me three questions. What about your ambassador? Don't you remember the Tata Indica? And what do you mean by an Indian company? The first two questions were easy to answer. I have an ambassador because nostalgia trumps logic, but I don't trust my ambassador for long runs. Don't I remember the Indica? Of course. But the only way to improve air traffic safety is to have plane crashes. Imagine if Tatas had been given a license to build cars in the 1960s, but most importantly, they have learned so much with the Jaguar Land Rover acquisition that Tata is now the third largest car maker in India and makes spectacular cars. Now, what is Indian was a more complicated question and really made me think, right? What's an Indian company? I mean, Tata Nexon has a large part of imported components. But if HDFC has 65% of its shareholders are outside India, is HDFC an Indian company? Lupin only has 30% of its revenues in India. Does that mean it's an Indian company? IBM actually has more employees in India than they do in the US. Does that mean it's an Indian company? Unilever PLC, more than 50% of their market cap is Hindustan Lever. Does that make it an Indian company? So I think traditionally we defined Indian enterprises by revenue, profit, headcount, or by market cap, and it's no longer insightful or simple to do that. But there are Indian companies with an Indian center of gravity, right? And I think this is sort of over the next 25 years, we really have to raise our ambition. In one of my favorite letters of Jawaharlal Nehru from 1942 from Ahmednagar jail, he wrote, whether we are successful or not, historians of the future will judge. But we aimed high and looked far. And that's really all we can do as entrepreneurs. We can aim high and look far. But converting those aims, you'll never have if you don't have a dream, how will you have a dream come true? And obviously our dream for India has been recalibrated. But obviously the dream for us individually as entrepreneurs for our firms sometimes requires really changing what made us successful, right? Because the most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves as entrepreneurs. We all need hearing aids. But I think the new India, the new Indians in the workforce, and the opportunity globally that we offer means that the 25 years in India, in the next 25 years, domestic consumption is really going to drive growth. And that creates huge opportunities for entrepreneurs who are willing to confront, be honest with themselves about the changes that are required, about the skills that they need to build, and about how they need to think about the future. But I'm confident that this is our next quarter century. And so good luck, Godspeed.